Radyo-Katipunan, 87.9 FM.
Calling on all young male professionals. Do you wish to live an extraordinary life? Are you tired of the routine and mundane and long for a dynamic, adventurous, and even dangerous life? Do you wish to make your life count and hope to make an impact long after you're gone? Do you wish to live a life of service to society, to country, and to dear Mother Earth? Then you are the one we are looking for. Consider the Society of Jesus. Join the church's gallant army and turn your world upside down. Call the Jesuits Vocations Promotions Team 426-6101, local 3406. Once again, 426-6101, local 3406.
Meron? Ano nga ba ang meron? Paano nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin mo, baby! Here's your chance! Lundagin mo, baby! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovi Miroy at Ron Capinding. Lundagin mo, baby! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin mo, baby! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis. Lundag na, Ateneo! Tara na't simulan ng inyong umaga sa mga magagandang refleksyon tungkol sa ating buhay at pananampalataya. Kasama sina Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle ng Manila, Father J. Boy Gonzales at Father Nono Alfonso ng Kapisanan ni Jesus, Father Cali Llamado ng Manila Cathedral at Binibining Risa Singson Kaupeng ng Light of Jesus Community dito sa Kapit Pandasal sa radyo-katipunan 87.9 FM.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Bee Gees. How deep is your love? How deep is your love? I really need to know. Magandang araw po. Magkapit pandasal muna tayo. Ito po si Father Nono. Pinapatugtog ko po lagi yan dati pag nagbibigay ako ng recollection o retreat sa panahon ng Kwaresma o Holy Week. Sabi ko, ang pinaka-sentro ng dakilang panahong ito ay pag-ibig, love. Si Jesus nag-alay ng buhay alang-alang sa pagmamahal sa atin. Ikaw, kapatid, gaano mo nga ba kamahal naman ang Diyos? How deep is your love? Kaya nga bilang paghahanda, hinihingan tayo ng mga sakripisyo, di ba? What are you giving up for Lent? Yan ang laging tanong. Doon natin naipapakita ang pag-ibig natin sa Diyos. Pero sabi po sa akin ng isang matandang pare, mali, baligtad daw po. Hindi raw po ang pagmamahal natin ang focus ng Kwaresma at Semana Santa, kundi ang pagmamahal ng Diyos sa atin. Nasukdulan niyang pinamalas sa atin sa krus. Saka na raw natin pag-isipan ng mga pagtatangka nating mahalin ng Diyos. Sa panahong ito, ang mahalaga ay pagnilayan natin, pagdasalan ang pag-ibig sa atin ng Diyos. Balikan, sariwain, damhin. Kapag naunawaan daw natin kung gaano kalalim, kadakila, kasukdulan ang pag-ibig sa atin ng Diyos, lalambot ang mga puso natin at sa wakas, matututo na rin tayong magmahal. Hanggat di natin natutuklasan, nararanasan ang pag-ibig na yan, di tayo mababago, di tayo matututong umibig. It is love that changes us. It is the deepest love that teaches us to love deeply. Kaya't ngayong Semana Santa, tunghayan, pagmasdan po natin si Jesus sa kanyang kalbaryo, sa kanyang krus, at hayaan siyang turuan tayo kung paanong tunay na magmahal. Amen.
Radyo, 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 katipunan, radyo, katipunan, radyo, katipunan, radyo, 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 katipunan, radyo, katipunan. The voice of the Blue Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay atin sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng eskwela. Radyo, 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 katipunan, radyo, 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 katipunan, radyo, katipunan, radyo, katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, katipunero sugo, todo sa kayod, tulong at tulong. Ipag the Blue Eagle, galing hiding at tigil.
Mamangha sa lalim at ganda ng ating kultura at diwang makabayan sa mga salita at pahina. Sa tulong ng mga guro at manunulat ng panitikang Pilipino, halina't tuklasin ang yaman ng ating panitikan, ang pamana ng ating lahi. Kasama si Binibining Andrea Trinidad, Ginoong Alvin Yapan at Ginoong Gary De Viles ng Kagawaran ng Filipino ng Pamantasang Ateneo de Manila. Ito ang Sari-Sari.
Good morning, Manila. Good evening in New York and Toronto. We are fortunate to have with us this morning three of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Nerissa Balce, Ferdinand Lopez, and Dr. Gary De Viles, for our webinar series in Sari-Sari, radyo-katipunan, and sponsored by the Office of Vice President for the University and Global Relations. Before we proceed, may we please remind everyone again to set their cameras and speakers off. During the open forum, we can use either the chat box or send raise hand signal so that we can acknowledge you. I am Anne Trinidad, your host for today's event, and with me is Dr. Alvin Yapan.
Okay, the topic for our webinar today is Precarious City, Films and Fascism. I will introduce the first speaker. Nerissa Balce is the author of the book Body Parts of Empire, Visual Abjection, Filipino Images, and the American Archive. She teaches courses on empire, race, gender, and popular culture at SUNY Stony Brook on Long Island, New York. She is currently working on a book on Filipino culture under authoritarian rule. We start with Dr. Nerissa Balce. We reserve all our comments and questions until the third speaker has delivered his or her presentation.
Hi, good morning, Manila, and good evening from Long Island, New York. Maraming salamat, Professor Yapan. So I'd like to begin by with my first slide, and the title of my talk today is called On Empire and Fascism. So I will be, give me a minute to, well, not a minute, a few seconds to share. Okay, there we go. There. And if I can just have someone from Dr. De Villas or anyone from the organizers, can you say that I'm sharing it right? You all see the slide? Yes? Can somebody confirm? Oh, okay. Okay, great. I see that it's working. Somebody said, all right, great. So I want to begin with this slide, and the title of my talk is on Empire and Fascism, Histories in P.J. Raval's film, Call Her Ganda. Sorry. So Jennifer Laude was a 26-year-old trans Filipina who wore her long caramel-colored hair on her shoulders. She was called Ganda, or beauty, and we see on this first slide an image of Jennifer Laude. She was called Ganda by her mother. It was also a nickname that she chose for herself. In Jennifer's Filipino queer working class culture, her intimate friends acknowledged her striking features, her confidence, and her intelligence. She was considered the leader of a group of young trans women who liked to go to bars together in Olongapo City, a port city visited by US warships and American soldiers for over a century. When her friends talk about her, they seem to say, at least it's suggested in the film, they seem to say, ang haba ng hair mo, Lola, right? And as we know, this is a familiar gay queer phrase in Filipino culture. It originates from Filipino beauty parlor culture, but it is also a recognition of Jennifer's trans beauty, her physical femininity, and how her public appearance simulates notions of Filipina beauty. And of course, when you say Lola, I don't really mean something ageist or someone who's older, but it actually refers to how she is revered, how she is so exalted, the way grandmothers are revered in Filipino culture. Ganda's beauty is the topic of my talk today, but also different meanings of Ganda, beauty as justice, as a desire for seeking the truth, as a desire for knowing history. So Ganda's brutal murder happened on October 11, 2014, and it is a murder case that is infamous. It is known by Filipinos in the Philippines, as well as Filipino immigrants in the US. In P.J. Raval's documentary film, Call Her Ganda, the film begins with the sound of rain hitting a wind chime, a melodious call to the viewer. The camera shows the interiors of a neat bedroom decorated with different photographs of a long-haired woman. And so what you see on this slide right now is an interior shot. That means that's the inside of a home. And of course, that's the home of the Laude family in Panay province. And we also see small like images of Jennifer in this shot. We hear the voice of Julita Laude, Jennifer's mother, and she explains that their home in Panay province, was paid for by Jennifer's hard work at a beauty salon. And the quote, when Julita Laude speaks in Tagalog, she says, at the beauty salon, she would wash and clean to get free food. And this is the mother speaking. Now, this initial scene sets up the story of Jennifer from her mother's eyes. The interior shots, or what you see as the inside, shots of a home, a very neat and modest home, are a testament to the hard work and the persona, the life of Jennifer as an obedient, kind, generous daughter. For the mother, this is the version that she believes. This is Ganda, this is Jennifer. Her daughter was a trans woman who worked in a beauty salon. But for her contemporaries, they also knew she worked in another place, a bar frequented by off-duty American soldiers in the port city of Olongapo. And so what we have next is an image from the documentary, Olongapo at Night. And I want us to think about how the images of Olongapo suggest a city that is occupied by a foreign power, in this case, the American military. So in the documentary of Raval, the film moves to video clips showing the neon sign of Ambiance nightlife bar, where Jennifer met the 19-year-old U.S. Marine Scott Joseph Pemberton. And the images from Olongapo City's entertainment district for example, that we see here in this slide, is meant to signal or to suggest how Jennifer's death was perceived and understood by Americans and the rest of the world. The familiar montage of news clips represent the third world as a site of crime, chaos, and aberrant sexualities. The images would seem to suggest, and I want to emphasize that here, it would seem that this was a simple case of murder. But the murderer was a white American soldier, and the victim was a transgender Filipina, who may or may not have been a sex worker. There would be nothing simple about this case because of the subjects and the histories that are connected to the event. Jennifer's murder and the Philippine presidential pardon for her murderer are stories related to the history of the U.S. empire and Filipino fascism. And I'll say more about these terms, empire and fascism, as I move on. Now, this is also another scene. There are some graphic images of Jennifer's corpse, her body, which I don't want to show here, but I want to show this scene from the documentary of the toilet that where her body was found. So in the documentary, Filipino-American journalist Mary Grace Talusan mentions the slurs and the transphobic outrage on social media during the murder trial. On social media, some Filipinos sided with Pemberton, arguing that he was tricked into having sex with Jennifer. Pemberton's rage was caused by his surprise at discovering Jennifer's identity as a transgender woman. Of course, this is undercut in the documentary. The lawyer of the Laude family, Virgie Suarez, mentions that there was a used condom that was found in the crime scene, but the American military quickly removed the used condom. This scene, this image that we see of the toilet, I want us to think about how we might think of Jennifer's trans body as a symbol of pain for not just for Filipinos in the Philippines, but also Filipinos in the diaspora. The disturbing image in the documentary of Jennifer's partially clad, bleeding and broken body is a symbol of pain. And we hear, as we see this scene of the toilet, we hear the Filipino-American journalist, Mary Grace Talusan. She says, Pemberton beat Jennifer savagely, and then he put on his clothes and walked calmly out of the motel. While the documentary was filmed before President Rodrigo Roa Duterte's term as president, I want to suggest here, and when the students of Panitikan will be watching the documentary, for your class, I want you to think of how this documentary is actually like a prologue. And as any Star Wars fan would know, a prologue means that's the beginning of something, right? And I want to suggest here that the documentary is actually a prologue of our fascist present, our authoritarian present. It is the beginning of our life under Duterte's violent republic. Now, I don't want to suggest this is the only prologue, this is the only beginning of the Duterte Republic, but this is one of the many beginnings. Because I study Filipino-American culture, I was very interested in this documentary by P.J. Raval. So the film is a prologue or a narrative that is about a beginning. It is a prologue of the different forms of state violence that would be committed by the Philippine state after 2016. the various miscarriages of justice, government inaction, incompetence, corruption, misogyny, various human rights abuses, and what the world would know as the signature horror of the Duterte administration, and that is the tens of thousands of extrajudicial deaths committed by the Philippine police. These current horrors are part of the knowledge of those of us watching this documentary that came out in 2018. So to watch Raval's documentary in 2020 is actually a way for us to think about our present life under the Duterte administration. Jennifer Laude's life is the story of working-class, non-binary Filipinas forced into low-wage jobs, such as her early stint at a beauty salon and her possible sex work in the bars of Olongapo. More than half a decade after her murder, and it's been 6 years. It's more than half a decade after her murder. President Duterte pardons the U.S. Marine, and this pardon underscores Duterte's loyalty to hetero-masculine institutions of power, the U.S. military-industrial complex, and his loyalty to his nation's Philippine military and police. The Jennifer Laude case cannot be viewed without the current developments of the case. How the Laude family's lawyer, the former human rights lawyer Harry Roque, whom we see here in this slide, Roque is now a spokesman for the Duterte government and is an important propagandist for the administration. Pemberton's pardon comes at a time when Filipinos are shot or shamed or punished for leaving their homes during the pandemic. In the film, Harry Roque is quoted asking, this is a quote from the film, Roque says, "What kind of self-respecting country can we be if we cannot even implement our laws when they are breached in our territory and when a victim is a Filipino?" Now, this moment in the film is a painful and ironic moment. This same lawyer, who seems to be a champion of a poor family from Panay province, will go on to be the face of an administration that has killed more than 30,000 Filipinos, mostly from poor families like the Laudes. The brutal murder of a trans-Filipina sex worker would seem ordinary in the Philippine or even Western news cycle. As trans activists have noted, there are hundreds of trans women and men that are murdered around the world. As the Trans Murder Monitoring Project, the TMM project, reports, it says that a total of 3,664 reported murders in 75 countries and territories worldwide have occurred between January 2008 to September 2020. But as the lawyer from the Laude family, the Laude family had two lawyers, Mr. Roque and Ms. Virgie Suarez. Virgie Suarez put it this way. She said that there is nothing ordinary about this case because the murder of Jennifer Laude was caused by a 19-year-old white American U.S. Marine. So Jennifer's murder and the pardon granted to the U.S. soldier is the history of U.S.-Philippine relations. In September 7, 2020, the 16th President of the Philippine Republic pardoned Jennifer Laude's killer, Scott Joseph Pemberton. The news of Pemberton's release was met with anger and protest in the Philippines and in the U.S. September marked the 7th month of the Luzon lockdown since Duterte called for strict stay-at-home orders for tens of millions of Filipinos living in the Philippine capital. And this also extended to other provinces outside of Manila. The lockdown meant the closure of jeepneys, buses, taxis, tricycles, and other forms of transportation. As we all know, those of us who live in the Philippines. On social media, stories of stranded day laborers and the working poor appeared regularly. A laid-off escalator mechanic walked miles so that he could join his children in their shanty. A father walked in the streets of Manila, cradling a shoebox that held the corpse of his dead baby. An unemployed maid, a mother of two, was stranded in a bus stop and died of infection, waiting for a bus that never came. And a former tennis instructor was denied treatment by 4 hospitals and died in a makeshift hospital tent. A Filipino soldier with post-traumatic disorder was shot in the streets by the police for not complying with stay-at-home orders. As Filipinos were forced to stay at home, and as we read these narratives, all these stories on social media of Filipinos being punished for not complying with quarantine orders, a US Marine was pardoned by Duterte and permitted to return home to the US. In the history of Philippine-American imperial relations, Philippine lives are violable. Violable meaning you can violate them. You can violate Filipino bodies, whereas white American lives are sacred. So I want us to think of the bodies that are violable, the bodies that could be violated. And then there are the bodies that are sacred, the white bodies, in this case, the white body of an American soldier. Raval's documentary highlights this colonial and post-colonial history for the viewer. The violation and brutal murder of Jennifer Laude is the history of the Philippines under the US Empire and the United States' continuing military presence in the Philippines and in the rest of Southeast Asia. Shown through disparate images, Raval's documentary offers visual cues of a familiar post-colonial story. The bright lights of the ambiance nightlife where Jennifer worked, the 5 large American Navy ships in the dock of Olongapo, the neon signage of a McDonald's over the darkened city streets of Olongapo, and the white cement walls of the American military base. So I want to end here by showing you some themes I think that are important for us when we think about Call Her Ganda. I think that the film is a film about empire and fascism, and the scenes that I showed you in this short presentation suggest these scenes of empire, the theme of empire, but the documentary also includes the beginning of the Duterte regime. And I want us to think of how, even if it's just the last half of the documentary, Raval's documentary has this desire to connect this history. So it wants to connect the history of empire and fascism as a way for us to understand Philippine life under the Duterte regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balce. Now, for our next speaker, let me introduce to you Dr. Gary De Viles. Gary De Viles is a film critic and a cultural studies scholar based in Manila. He was educated in Australia and teaches at the Ateneo de Manila University. He is editor of the book Pasakale, Isang Paglalayag sa Kasaysayan ng Panitikang Filipino, and co-editor of the book Kritikal na Espasyo ng Kulturang Popular. His new book, Sensing Manila, is published by Ateneo de Manila University Press. Everyone, let us welcome Dr. Gary De Viles.
Thank you, Anne. I'll be reading the article that we co-wrote, Dr. Nerissa, Balce, and Ferdi and I, Ferdi Lopez, that was published by Asian American Writers Workshop blog, and I'll be discussing the film Aswang by Alex Arumpa. It is the summer of the pandemic and protest for police abolition. It is the summer of horror and hope. In the streets of Toronto, Berlin, Auckland, Copenhagen, Antwerp, the young and the old march for racial justice while wearing masks for protection against the dreaded COVID-19 virus that has infected more than 11.6 million people around the world. In the US, the premature deaths of Black men and women in the hands of the police reignite the American protest against the horror police killings. In New York City, Thousands march in the warm evenings, led by young black and queer activists. They camp out in front of Mayor Bill de Blasio's mansion holding signs, Black Lives Matter. No justice, no peace, no racist police, and abolish ICE. In the sweltering evenings, citizens curse under their breaths as firecrackers explode in the dead of the night, interrupting precious sleep. Rumors swirl that the NYPD is behind the sale of the firecrackers, a tactic to tire out and punish New Yorkers demanding the end of prisons and the police. In New York City, church-based immigrants rights group and Filipino-American journalists organized an online webinar against a different but similar kind of state violence. The event, State Terrorism, the Philippine Experience. It was attended by close to 100 participants and featured Manila-based writer Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch, veteran journalist Inday Espina Verona of the beleaguered ABS-CBN, and human rights lawyer Nery Colmenares. The event marked the passage of a new law created by the Duterte government, the Anti-Terror Bill. The law appoints a council of Philippine government officials to arrest anyone suspected of being a terrorist. And the vagueness of who can be defined and charged as a terrorist makes the law frightening. The law permits the surveillance and wiretap of citizens by the police and the military for 90 days. The new law, says Nery, abolishes the protections enshrined in the 1987 Philippine Constitution by not requiring warrants for arrest, and those arrested for terrorism could be kept in jail for 24 days. Filipinos in the Philippines and around the globe condemn the new law as a weapon that targets Duterte's critics, incarcerates his perceived enemies, muzzles free speech, and intensifies a climate of fear that began with Duterte's war against drugs. Rather than propose a comprehensive plan for mass testing or national economic projects to aid the poor and affected by the pandemic and the quarantine, the Duterte government rushed the passing of anti-terror bill. The new law continues the old ways of the Duterte state: kill law breakers. Since May 2016, the Duterte government's violent drug war has claimed the lives of more than 30,000 Filipinos. Most are men, women, and children from the slums of Philippine cities. The corpses of the dead bear the mark of torture. Bleeding cuts, blue-black bruises from the repeated beat claim they were killed in shootouts, nanlaban, as they say, or they deserve death as drug users and criminals. Some of the dead are found with duct tape covering their heads so that identifying them is impossible. Those extrajudicial killings, described by scholars as a genocide of the poor, continue in the pandemic. Bodies and pools of blood appear on the city streets, and the human remains look like the victims of flesh-eating monster we call aswang. The monster of Philippine life are the subject of Alex Arumpak's debut documentary Aswang, or Monster. The documentary had its East Coast premiere last February at the Doc Fortnight 2020 at the Momos Festival of International Nonfiction Film and Media. Arumpak's film received honors from Greece Thessaloniki International Film Festival and the International Critics FIPRESC Fresky Award at the 2019 International Documentary Film Festival, Amsterdam. The film offers a powerful meditation on contemporary Philippine life under the Duterte regime through two lives. The story of Jo Marie, a child of the slums, and Brother June, a priest, and a photojournalist who works in the slums to help families affected by the government's violent drug war. Both subjects are the central figures of the film's critique of the Philippine state, the state as a monster. In Arumpak's documentary, horror is an allegorical language to narrate state violence. Filipinos have a long tradition of telling horror stories. From our folktales to children's stories, everyday occurrences marked by unexplainable phenomena and supernatural encounters are meant to frighten and to enforce social mores. Because of the place of monster in the Philippine imagination, Filipino culture reserves a specific space for the horrifying and the terrifying. In fact, there is a constellation of different emotions connected to the different terms for fright in the local languages. No? Hilakbot, gulantang, gimbal, takot, balisa, pangamba, sindak, paggabag, gulat, and pagkabahala. These are all emotive responses, no, to the macabre. In Arumpak's documentary film, true to their form as shape shifters, no, have retained their shape shifting, flexible, and adaptive nature. No? That's why they no longer inhabit the remote mythical time and place of Filipino tales that begin with once upon a time or noong unang panahon, no? In a distant land, palayong lugar. The monster now live in the cities, the metropolis, the suburbs, the conurbations, and the non-urban areas formed by uneven economic development, gentrification, migration, technological shifts, and globalization. Some of these nocturnal creatures have embraced the light, allowing them to appear human. Their mutations have enabled them to coexist in the spaces we inhabit in different times of the day, and we are unaware of their true nature. In Western Gothic stories, the presence of a reliable narrator is an important requisite to create the audience's willing suspension of disbelief, so that the story can cast a vast net of fright. In Arumpak's film, the reliable narrator is in fact Manila, the monster city. The city is not only the narrator but also a living organism, a witness to the ongoing degradations of Philippine life, whether it be the persisting social injustice caused by the extrajudicial killings, the soul-crushing poverty, or the recurring moments of dehumanization experienced by the urban poor in the hands of police. The city is a dynamic, pulsating character, a narrator in the film, a recorder, a historian, documenting the everyday. As a hovering presence, the city memorializes the trauma of the individual, the family, community, and the Philippine nation. The city is traumatized as it is traumatizing in the film from beginning to end. Arumpak presents, no, gruesome images of violence, destruction, and death in the city. In as long as the monsters leave a state of terror in their wake, dead and mangled bodies are sprawled on the streets of Manila as remainders and reminders of the Philippine state's all-out war on drugs and drug users. The economically deprived and the marginalized are disposable, dispensable, collateral damage in the state's gentrification projects for economic regeneration, securitization, and foreign investments. In the monster city, the monsters are mass individuals with guns, riding in tandem on motorbikes. They are the harbingers of state-sanctioned death. But the monsters also wear different clothing and appear in different shapes when they are encountered by those living in the slum communities and informal settlements. Both young and old are told to sleep, close their eyes, not to look at the eyes of monsters in order to be safe. But in reality, no one is safe in the city or beyond the city. The living dead roam the city. They inhabit cemeteries, the dark alleys, the police stations where they work behind the desk or are confined in coffin-like cells hidden in the envelope in total darkness. You will see actually most of these scenes in the film. No? Police operatives can come without any warrant to arrest, to kill and suspected individuals inside their houses, and then plant pieces of evidence to justify their brutality. From myth to reality, from Filipino to folklore, to the everyday. The monsters of our imagination now live with us. They roam the streets of early 21st century Manila, the living, the dead, and the living dead. Arumpak's documentary film is a return to the traditions of Filipino oral literature and the storytelling of folk tales. The film rewrites Philippine folklore by upending the structure of storytelling. Rather than the usual doting grandmother regaling her grandchildren with scary stories, the storyteller is in fact also a child, the young Jo Marie, a friend of the slain teen Kian de los Santos, whose premature death caused national outrage and protest. The documentary focuses on the horrors of horrors Jomari has witnessed in his young life. His mourning for his friend Kian, the daily grind of poverty, the incarceration of his drug addict parents, and how he must work and earn his meal on a daily basis. The child of the city, Jomari, is the second storyteller of state violence. And his name is a contraction of the names of the holy parents of Jesus Christ, Joseph and Mary. Orphaned by the state with his parents behind bars, Jomari's fate is similar to thousands of children orphaned by Tokhang or the extrajudicial killings. Jomari bears the contradiction of his situation, as he is left on his own, scavenging with fellow street children. Since Duterte came to power, he fulfilled his campaign promise of killing criminals. For the regime, drug users were criminals, who were animals that deserved death. In his public speeches, Duterte normalizes a fascist logic. To bring modernity and order to the Philippine Republic, there must be a purging of criminals and other malcontents. Death is a fitting end for those who break the law and for the regime. Drug users do not deserve treatment or rehabilitation, but punishment through death. Pac's documentary questioned this fascist logic by examining the living targets of state violence, the poor of Manila. The film is a fine example of Filipino feminist filmmaking. Pac's feminist gaze does not merely record death, but grants life by humanizing those targeted and rejected by the Philippine state. Pac's lens focuses lovingly on the bodies of the poor with no distance, as though she wants us to see the large and small wounds made by the state on their bodies and their psyches. Throughout the film, we have close-ups of the bodies of men, women, and children who describe their lives under the Duterte regime. We hear their voices. The police are our enemy. They shot a boy while he was feeding birds. They took my husband, shot him like an animal. They tortured and killed my teenager son. Pac's feminist method of filming is through witnessing and participation. We see Jomari and the other children pretend to shoot, hit, and cut up one of the younger boys in their group. The tight shots of Jomari and the children visually suggest that we, the audience, participate in the children's act of killing. In Duterte's era of machismo, the film offers a counter-figure of fascist masculinity. The long-haired and soft-spoken Cyriaco Santiago III, known as Brother June, a redemptorist religious missionary from the National Shrine of Our Mother Perpetual Health in Baclaran, Manila. Like Jomari, Brother June is a creature and a creation of the city, and is the film's third storyteller. In one scene, he meets with other priests and religious leaders to discuss EJKs, the extrajudicial killings. He narrates that before 2016, the church would receive 3 requests a week for financial help for burying their dead. Now it's almost 3 per day. Brother June says there are almost 31,232 accounted Tokhang victims at that time. As a man of the cloth, Brother June is traditionally cast as the shepherd of God's flock, as he administers to the sick and the poor for his parish. Beyond his role as shepherd, he is also able to exorcise or cast out demons and monsters. But here we must wrestle with his own demons, as he desperately tries to listen to the voice of God with every story of state terror that he encounters. One mother explains how her son was innocent and could not have been a drug courier since he had no motorbike, contrary to what the police claim. Another family member shares that his late brother worked at the fish port and left behind 5 children. And the mortician of the Eusebio funeral home says that one victim must have been a police informant, who, like the rest of the drug addicts, was killed so that he would be silenced forever. Brother June gathers these stories not inside the church confessional, but beyond church walls, in the homes of his parishioners, in the streets of the city, in the funeral parlors, in whispers in the dead of night. In the film, a haunting, disembodied female voice serves as the most important storyteller. While typical Filipino stories of the aswang cast the monster as a shape-shifting female, here the female narrator is not an aswang, but a diwata, an oracle or priestess, a guardian spirit who protects her domain. usually a forest, a mountain, or a river. The Diwata is also a benefactor of townspeople who depend on her domain's bounty and resources. Our past Diwata comes from a long line of Diwatas of many Filipino stories, novels, and political plays. The Diwata reveals the truth of the great monster devouring and oppressing the Filipino people. She warns of the harrowing days to come, and that this is only the beginning of the people's battle against all monsters. I like to, we read also the last line of the Diwata here. Kapag sinasabi nilang may aswang, ang gusto talaga nilang sabihin ay matakot ka. Itong lusod na napiling tambakan ng mga katawan ay lalamunin ka. Tulad kung paano nilalamon ng takot ang tatag. Pero meron pa ring natatakot at nagagawang harapin ang halimaw. Dito nagsisimula. I end with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gary.
Mamangha sa lalim at ganda ng ating kultura at diwang makabayan sa mga salita at pahina. Sa tulong ng mga guro at manunulat ng panitikang Pilipino, halina't tuklasin ang yaman ng ating panitikan, ang pamana ng ating lahi. Kasama si Binibining Andrea Trinidad, Ginoong Alvin Yapan at Ginoong Gary De Viles ng Kagawaran ng Filipino ng Pamantasang Ateneo de Manila. Ito ang Sari-Sari,